Saturday night, the sheriff of Spokane County stood in front of cameras and said somewhere between 50 and 100 buildings had burned. He wasn't lying. He wasn't guessing carelessly. He was telling the truth as far as anyone could see it. By 6 o'clock the next morning, the real number was 640. Not a correction, a measurement of how completely a fire can outrun the ability of the people standing inside it to understand what is happening to them. To understand how a number can be wrong by a factor of 13 and still be an honest number, you have to go back a little further than Saturday. You have to go back to a Friday afternoon when a government agency reached for a warning it had never used before, not once, in the entire recorded history of a state. The National Weather Service calls it a particularly dangerous situation alert. It sits one full step above a standard red flag warning, and it is not handed out for ordinary bad luck with wind and dry grass. It is reserved for a narrow, ugly combination of conditions where forecasters believe fire behavior is going to outpace what firefighters on the ground are physically capable of doing about it. Washington State had never issued one. Then, on a Friday in late July, it issued one for the very next day, covering most of eastern Washington, from Spokane out through the Waterville Plateau, the Okanogan Valley, the western Columbia Basin, the Colville Reservation, the Palouse, and the Snake River country. The people whose job it is to read that kind of language for a living did not treat it as boilerplate. A Wildland Fire Division manager with the state's Department of Natural Resources put it plainly the day before anything actually happened. Fuels on the ground were already dangerously dry. Fires that started under those conditions were already proving difficult to control. And the wind forecast for Saturday, he said, was going to create explosive fire growth of a kind rarely seen anywhere in the state. Everything downstream of that sentence started moving immediately. The governor activated more than 100 members of the Washington National Guard and sent them to fire lines across the state, the first mobilization of its kind in years, stacked on top of Guard helicopter crews that had already been assigned to fire duty earlier that month. The regional power utility told the public out loud that it might cut electricity on purpose in parts of the region, because it did not trust what its own power lines might do in wind gusting past 40 miles an hour. Before a single fire in Spokane County had even ignited, the governor declared a statewide wildfire emergency and a burn ban that would run all the way through the end of September. The city fire department, which normally runs with somewhere around 70 firefighters on a given shift, nearly doubled that number. The sheriff's office added staff too. That is what it looks like when a warning system works exactly the way it is supposed to. Everyone who could see the forecast believed it and acted on it before there was anything to react to. Hold on to that, because of what happened next. Shortly before noon on Saturday, a fire started in brush and dry grass on the west side of the county, near where two rural roads meet just north of a small community outside Spokane. The first estimate put it at around 50 acres. 20 minutes later, it was already double that. The conditions it landed in were the exact conditions the forecast had described days earlier, almost as if it had been given a script. Winds were gusting into the 40s out of the southwest, sustained in the 20s and 30s. Humidity had dropped into the single digits. There was nothing standing between the flame and open grassland in every direction. A meteorologist with the Weather Service had said something the day before that reads, in hindsight, less like a general warning and more like a direct prediction of this specific fire. If a new fire starts under these winds, he said, it is going to be very hard to get any kind of containment on it right away. He'd also pointed out, almost as an aside, that ignition sources in town were mundane. Mowing dry grass could do it. A trailer chain dragging sparks across pavement could do it. Nobody needed malice for a fire like this to start. It just needed one ordinary, careless moment, meeting one extraordinary afternoon of wind. State firefighting resources were called in within about 90 minutes. Before 3:30 that afternoon, evacuation orders inside Spokane city limits had already reached the highest level, the kind that means leave immediately, not the kind that means keep an eye on things. Those zones kept growing for the rest of the day. And while crews were still trying to get equipment in front of that first fire, the county got a second one. Just before 4 in the afternoon, a separate fire broke out on the opposite side of the county, opening up another huge evacuation zone, stretching between two major roads. A few hours after that, a third fire ignited to the northwest of where the first one had started. 3 major fires, one county, one afternoon, one wind field pushing all 3 of them at once. What the first of those fires did over the next several hours is the part of this story that should not have been physically possible under any ordinary reading of how fire behaves. It pushed into a state park along the edge of the city and tore through it fast, running toward the Spokane River, narrowly missing a footbridge, and then, this is the detail that stops people, it jumped the river. A moving body of water, the kind of natural fire break people have relied on for as long as there have been fires, did not stop it. On the far bank it kept climbing, burning uphill through a landfill on the city's north side, brushing past a memorial park, throwing flame at a sports complex, tearing through a residential neighborhood, crossing a major road and pushing on into another neighborhood, built along a ridge known locally as 5 Mile Prairie. By roughly 4:30 in the afternoon, smoke and flame were visible coming over the tree line next to a church on the north side of town. Police were driving north on the same road that residents were using to flee south, and some of those residents had to drive past homes that were already burning in order to get out at all. The evacuations did not stop at private homes. A veterans medical center evacuated its patients and staff. A rehabilitation facility moved its residents out to wait in an open field for buses to arrive. A university sent security guards door to door through empty dormitories to confirm nobody had been left behind. By 7:30 that evening, homes near an elementary school were on fire, and the smoke overhead had grown thick enough to blot out most of the remaining daylight. By 8 o'clock, on a little over 8 hours after the very first fire had ignited, federal fire tracking put that fire alone at more than 3,500 acres. The regional utility reported around 40,000 customers without power, some of it cut deliberately as a precaution, including in neighborhoods well outside any evacuation zone. The city opened an emergency shelter downtown after the first shelter location lost power of its own. Buses began arriving, carrying elderly residents from nursing homes and assisted living facilities. Hundreds of families ended up spending the night there. The fairgrounds opened up as overflow space for recreational vehicles and for the animals that evacuees couldn't take with them. The language coming from officials that night is worth sitting with because it is unusually direct for people speaking in the middle of an active emergency. An assistant chief with the fire department told reporters flatly that there isn't a fire department anywhere in the country that can handle a wind-driven fire of that size. He also had to ask residents to stop running garden sprinklers on their own homes because the city's water towers and pumping systems were already under strain from how many people were pulling water out of the system at once, all trying to protect their own property at the same time. The county sheriff called in every deputy available to help with door-to-door evacuations and told residents to prepare to be away from home for at least a day and a half. He also said something that tends to get lost underneath the bigger numbers, that his office was still running into far too many people who simply refused to leave. The state's adjutant general, addressing reporters that same night after 38 years in the job, said these were the worst fire conditions he had personally ever seen, and then added a line that turned out to be more accurate than he probably wanted it to be. When the sun comes up tomorrow, he said, we are going to be in shock. 9 hours after the first fire had been reported, city officials still could not say with any confidence whether anyone had been hurt. The mayor told reporters they weren't yet in a position to describe the scale of property loss. And the sheriff, working entirely off what fire chiefs could see with their own eyes from the ground, gave the number that opened this story: somewhere between 50 and 100 structures gone. Damage assessment teams began moving through the burn area at 6 the next morning. A fire chief with one of the county's fire districts reported that the largest of the 3 fires had, on its own, destroyed 640 structures. Many of them were inside city limits. Entire blocks in 2 neighborhoods had burned all the way down to bare foundations. The estimate from the night before had been 50 to 100. The real number, once daylight and access made it possible to actually count, was more than 6 times higher than the top end of that guess, and up to 13 times higher than the low end. That gap is not a story about a careless sheriff. It's a story about the physical limits of human perception during an event moving faster than anyone's ability to observe it. Nobody was lying on Saturday night. They were standing inside something too large and too fast-moving to see clearly from any single vantage point at night, with smoke obscuring most of it anyway. By Sunday morning, the state's Emergency Operations Center put the region-wide number at roughly 700 structures, including homes. By the following day, reporting had moved even further past that. Roughly 5,000 additional structures were listed as threatened. More than 18,000 homes and over 65,000 people were under evacuation orders inside city limits alone, with more than that across the wider county.